Hello there, everyone. In this video, I'm going to go over the Second Jewish-Roman War, otherwise known as the Kitos War. This revolt by the Jews against the Romans is actually quite overlooked in history, and sadly, there's not as much information on it as the First and Third Roman-Jewish Wars. But either way, it's still a major conflict between the Jews and the Romans. The name of the war comes from the man who ended it, Lucius Quietus. He was actually a Berber prince whose father had served the Romans so well they gifted his family Roman citizenship. He had done very well for himself in life, so much so that he actually became close with the Emperor Trajan. You can actually see his cavalry force on Trajan's column. Or, like right here, the picture you're seeing is them on the column. But let's back it up a little bit here and set the stage before we get back to Lucius. The first Jewish revolt ended against Rome in 73 CE, and during that war and the siege of Jerusalem, the Holy Temple was destroyed. And many Jews lost their lives or were sold into slavery. It was, and still is for the Jewish people, a very embarrassing and shameful defeat in their own eyes. The amount of losses, both physical and spiritual, left the Jewish people very embittered towards their new Roman overlords. Now, what actually caused the revolt to start isn't fully known. Some historians theorize that it was Parthian meddling that got the Jewish population all riled up. But the fact that the rebellion was so out of the blue, the multiple different leading figures, and quite frankly, the undisciplined and brutal way that the rebels went about things, it points much more to a spontaneous uprising that was caused by a variety of negative factors. And also, just the fact that the young men and women who had grown up hearing their parents and grandparents tell harrowing stories of the times when the barbaric Romans came into their lands, destroyed their cities, burned their sacred temple, and killed and enslaved thousands upon thousands of their people. These young men and women, they had now grown up and were not only able, but very willing to try and avenge the crimes the Romans had committed against their ancestors. This rebellion starts in the year 115 CE, so it's only been about 42 years since the destruction of the temple and the loss to the Romans in the First War. It was in the year 115 that the Roman Emperor Trajan, who was part of the Nerva-Antonine dynasty, the dynasty that took power after the Flavian dynasty, who was part of the First Roman-Jewish War. I talked about them a little bit in my other videos. Trajan was in the process of trying to conquer the Parthian Empire, and in doing so, while marching through Mesopotamia, he would leave small garrisons of Romans behind him to, let's just say, hold down the fort while he conducted his business. Well, one day, those small garrisons of Roman men were surrounded by armed groups of Jewish men and destroyed completely. And at the same time, basically, in the province of Cilicia, a man by the name of Lucas gathered together a ragtag band of men in the city of Cyrene, where they systematically went through the city destroying the Roman and Greek temples, as well as attacking anybody that they could get their hands on. Cassius Dio writes, "Meanwhile, the Jews in the region of Cyrene had put one Andreas at their head, and were destroying both the Romans and the Greeks. They would cook their flesh, make belts for themselves of their entrails, anoint themselves with their blood, and wear their skins for clothing. Others they would give to wild beasts, and force still others to fight as gladiators. In all, consequently, 220,000 perished. In Egypt, they also performed many similar deeds, and in Cyprus, under the leadership of Artemio, there, likewise, 240,000 perished. For this reason, no Jew may set foot in that land. And even if one of them is driven upon the island by the force of the wind, he is put to death." After destroying the city of Cyrene, Lucas and his followers, they didn't stop there. They made their way into Egypt and then headed towards the famous city of Alexandria. And when they arrived, they found that the Roman governor Marcus Rutilius Lupus had abandoned the city and left the inhabitants to fend for themselves. Well, that didn't really work out for them, because when the rebels under Lucas arrived, they teamed up with the local Jewish communities, and of course they had been quarreling with the local Greek population for decades, and had been under the rule of the Romans as well. So the result was a massive amount of killing and arson attacks all throughout the city. The local Greeks and Romans had no chance to fight back or escape. The arson was so bad that a portion of Alexandria was completely destroyed, as well as the tomb of Pompey the Great, the man who first brought the Romans to Judea and walked into the Holy of Holies in Jerusalem, and was disappointed to find no statue or idol of this Jewish god called Yahweh. When the news of the revolt reached the island of Cyprus, the Jews there, under a man named Artemion, also began a bloody revolt that saw the capital of Cyprus, the city of Salamis, be burned to the ground and 250,000 Greeks be slaughtered, according to Cassius Dio. The Jews hit this place so hard that when the war is done, laws will be put into place barring any Jew from coming to the island, and that even if one of them were shipwrecked, like just by accident, and they ended up on the coast, like not their fault at all, the people of Cyprus, they would execute them. And with all these other rebellions kicking off, of course, the uprisings spread into the Jewish homeland of Judea, where two men, Julianos and Pappos, gathered together their forces and took the town of Lydda by force. Now, Trajan, the emperor, he had been making his way back through Mesopotamia, recapturing the towns and smaller villages that he had already taken but then lost to the rebels. He took Nisbis, Edessa, Osroene, and Seleucia, which they all held a large Jewish rebel force, but in the end were taken. But it was during the siege of Hatra that he suffered what people believe to be a heat stroke, which caused him to pull out of the siege and begin a long journey back to Italy and Rome, where he was hoping that the cooler climate would help him recover better. But, sadly, after setting sail at Seleucia, very quickly his health deteriorated, and the fleet had to go ashore at Selinus, where the 63-year-old emperor passed away, and his successor Hadrian took his place. But before Trajan died, he had sent two men to deal with the rebellion in other parts of the empire. The Praetorian prefect Quintus Marcius Turbo was sent to Egypt and Cyrene at the head of several legions, where over the course of 2 years he beat down and demoralized the rebels until finally, in the year 117, the year that Trajan died, he was able to fully squash any remaining rebels and force the rebel leader Lucas to flee with his remaining followers to Judea. Sadly, the events of these 2 years are not documented anywhere I could find, but I really, really wish we did have some sources, like we did for the First Jewish-Roman War, about these 2 years. I mean, I can only imagine the battles and the sieges that Quintus and his legions got into over the course of, a full 2-year campaign. But we do know that in the end, he and his men were successful in defeating the rebellion in the provinces where he was in control. In Mesopotamia, the guy I mentioned earlier, Lucius Quietus, he was given a predominantly cavalry force, and he spent his 2 years driving out almost all of the Jewish peoples from the land of Mesopotamia, and by the year 117, he had joined Turbo in Judea, as this had now become the last stronghold for the Jews and the final area of the revolt. They both put the city of Lydda under siege, where after enduring months of hardship, the Jewish defenders fell back from the walls, and eventually fell altogether in the face of a Roman infantry assault. The Romans killed every single defender of Lydda, and then crucified many of them on top of the walls and throughout the city. The slain of Lydda are actually referenced in the Talmud. The amount of death and destruction during the Kitos War was massive. 220,000 Greeks and Romans were slaughtered in Egypt and Cyrene, and another 240 to 250,000 on the island of Cyprus alone are said to have been slain. Dio, he doesn't record the amount of Jewish deaths, but that's probably because nobody could even come up with a number for how many of them had died. The war was so traumatic for the people on the island of Cyprus, like I said earlier, that for a century afterwards, they forbade any Jewish person from stepping foot on their island, and if they did, the penalty was death. After the destruction of Lydda, the new emperor Hadrian actually decided to end the war and also abandon pretty much all of the conquest Trajan had achieved. He then installed a puppet king named Parthomespatus as head of the kingdom of the Osroene, which for the next century would sit between the Parthian and Roman empires as a sort of a buffer state. I'm sure most of you know the rest of Hadrian's story, since he's one of the most famous Roman emperors in history, and one of the 5 good emperors. Marcus Rutilius, though, he actually ended up becoming one of the most important people in the history of the Roman brick building industry. Kind of random, but it just goes to show you that there was many more ways to become a rich and powerful man in ancient times, besides through warfare and through conquest. It's believed that where the present-day Vatican stands, he had ownership of the clay deposits there, and that they had produced, he and his people had produced bricks for the many different Roman horia that began to be built around the city. The horia, or horium, was a public storage house that held all grain, all the different grains and stuff like that the city of Rome had to import to keep it running. And it's believed the very first horium was actually built by the famous tribune Gaius Gracchus back in 123 BC. Marcus Rutilius, he will pass away sometime near the year 123 CE. As for the Moorish prince Lucius Quietus, well, he wasn't close at all with the new Emperor Hadrian like he was with Trajan, and about a year after his victories, he was unceremoniously assassinated. After his successes in the Kitos War, the theory goes that Hadrian had him killed because he was much, much too popular with the legions, and Hadrian was worried that he might try and usurp his throne. So the once friend of an emperor was murdered by another. And that pretty much sums up all we know historically about the Kitos War, which was the second Jewish revolt against Roman rule. The Kitos War was just as devastating to the Romans as it was to the Jews. The amount of loss, whether it be in lives or land, was absolutely huge, and it could be one of the reasons why in the third and final Roman-Jewish War, the Romans reacted with such brutal repressions. The Bar Kokhba revolt, which will break out in 15 years after the end of the Kitos War, will be the most bloody and brutal war between the Romans and the Jews in all their history. This war will destroy Judea, and almost the Jewish people as a whole. When the dust settles, not a single Jewish person will remain untouched by this war. Their ancient and holy city will be utterly destroyed, and for the few remaining survivors who didn't lose their lives in the fighting or were taken captive and sold into slavery, they will find themselves banned from even entering the province of Judea, and will be forced into exile and live in a state of desperation for generations to come. The Romans will then do everything they can to try and erase the memory of the Jewish people and Judea from history, even changing the name of the entire region. It's where we get the name we call it today from. The Romans named this new province Syria Palestinia, Palestine. And if you know anything about Palestine, which it'd be hard not to nowadays, you'll know the fighting over this land won't ever stop. For another, well, actually, it hasn't stopped. It continues to this day. Except instead of the Assyrians and Babylonians, or the Romans and the Parthians, it's the Jews and the Muslims. Anyways, I got off track a little bit there at the end. Just a little bit, but I hope you guys enjoyed the video. And have a good one.